Hi guys, welcome back to Mysteries channel. Thank you for clicking on my video. It's very much appreciated. In my previous video, I brought up Homo erectus. This hominid gets a lot less love these days because of the spotlight shown on Neanderthal and Denisovan. But when we look at Homo erectus, we should look at them in awe. The extinct ancient human, Homo erectus, is a species of firsts. It was the first of our relatives to have human-like body proportions with shorter arms and longer legs relative to its torso. He was also the first hominid to migrate out of Africa. Now, you guys know that I don't buy into the current timeline presented. I believe that not only are we much older than what is taught, but also that in ancient times, the ancient past, there was some kind of shared culture across the planet. I don't know if it was a world society or if a select few knew of the scope of the world and traveled to places sharing the ideas and cultures of others, but I lean closer to a type of world culture. There are too many similar myths and histories to ignore on top of the whole drug and medicinal plant trade-off that is documented. Anyway, I came across some stuff while researching the origin of language that blew my mind. So let's go over Homo erectus and see if there's any truth to what I said in my language video. Is it possible that language did not start with Homo sapiens but with archaic man? And is it possible that we learned tool making and communication in the form of language from them? And if these are true, what else did we learn from them? To figure this out, first let's go over the most successful hominid we know of to date. In terms of species survival, Homo erectus is a huge success. Fossil evidence for Homo erectus stretches back almost 2 million years, making him by far the longest surviving of all of our relatives. Compared to us, Homo sapiens have only been on the scene for about 400,000 years. Knowing this fact alone, we begin to appreciate their ability to survive over long periods of time marked by many changes to the environment and climate. Big changes at that. It is safe to say that they saw things, big changes to Earth. Not only that, but Homo erectus was the most geographically widespread species apart from Homo sapiens. Homo erectus appeared in Africa about 2 million years ago, evolving from either a late form of Australopithecus or one of the more primitive forms of Homo that we just don't even know about, and then went on to spread to parts of Asia and parts of Europe, much like we did. It is written that they died out as a species about 250,000 years ago with last evidence in Indonesia, except for the piece of them that lives on in us. Because that's right, they're in our genetic record as well. However, the history of Flores man slaps that notion right in the face, but I'll get to that in a bit. The name Homo erectus means upright man. We have known he was a traveler who used and manufactured tools. He is the beginning of the information age that has not stopped since he walked the earth. His brain was 75% the size of ours, and he stood almost as tall as us. He was a hunting machine. He also built and upgraded tools over time: hammers, axes, spears, boats. That's right, I said boats. And the boats that he made didn't just merely travel lakes and rivers, but oceans. We know this because of Flores, Indonesia. That's right, Flores, what seems to be a hot spot for migrating ancient humanity. If Flores sounds familiar, maybe you remember the video I did when we spoke of Flores man. Flores man was Homo floresiensis. He was a small species of archaic man that left fossilized evidence in Indonesia. Flores man was a species of Homo erectus that over time became smaller because of islandization. Check out that video if you're interested in more about that. To get to what is now Flores, Indonesia, they had to travel through some of the most treacherous ocean currents in the world. The journey was only about 24 miles, but it was extremely dangerous and there was no way they swam there. I am willing to bet that they didn't even make it there on their first try. Instead, failing, innovating, trying again and again and again until success. They were thinkers driven by the need to know what was the world around them. They also traveled to places as far as 150 miles out into the ocean, not just because they were nomads with nothing else better to do, but evidence shows that they were aware of the world around them and their place in it. And because of their awareness, they needed to know more. These ancient men that were considered the typical caveman in the past, grunting and barely surviving on this treacherous planet, seem pretty far off when you look at their accomplishments. Now, evidence shows that they had the vocal apparatus of a gorilla, but don't get confused by this. They were not gorillas. Homo erectus was much closer to us than a gorilla, evident in all that they accomplished, including perhaps in communication. I don't think they communicated anywhere close to how we do now, but I do believe they had a form of language. Perhaps one with few words, but words nonetheless. What is a word? What is a word? A word is a single distinct meaningful element of sound, speech, or writing used with others or sometimes alone to form an understanding of something being communicated. There are a couple of other aspects of language that I want to cover: phonemes and morphemes. I covered phonemes in my last video, so check that one out if you're interested. So I'm just going to give a very brief explanation of morphemes. A morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in a language. A morpheme is not identical to a word, but can be the base to a word. It gets long and boring in this part, so I'll spare you hours of me trying to explain something that I barely understand myself, and I'll just get to the point. A language needs sounds strung together to denote meaning. In truth, you can have a language with very few sounds and very few words, as long as the sounds strung together differently have different meanings. Much discussion among anthropologists in the 1800s around primitive language and the societies that use these languages is now known to be baseless and false. Their argument was that since some languages didn't have extensive vocabularies and grammar, the language and the people were primitive, less intelligent, and inferior. They were unable to catalog history with great detail and knew less about the world around them. Some examples given by these anthropologists were the Aboriginal languages of Australia and the languages of Oceania. Interesting that those are also the languages that were part of the study on phonemes before. We now know how utterly wrong they were, right? It is now accepted that what was once considered an Aboriginal myth, spoken and told in the so-called primitive Aboriginal language, is actually a retelling of history. These languages that were so easily categorized as primitive captured the oldest surviving historical records known to man through oral tradition. And many times these languages did have grammatical complexities. Anthropologists just didn't understand them. Basically, it comes down to this: since all languages communicate equally well for those who naturally use them, no language is degenerate in that sense. Any language can communicate any idea if you take the trouble to work through it. In reality, there is no primitive language for us, and not even for them, Homo erectus. People usually expect what is called a primitive language to be simple, but the further back you go in the study of language, the more complications you find. Simplicity is the nature of the ability to generalize, and primitive man found it hard to generalize. One word or group of sounds for this man's weapon, and another word or group of sounds for that man's weapon, but no word for weapon. Now, I said it before and I will say it again. We share so much more with archaic man than we like to admit. And when we do admit it, we degrade it, claiming that our societies only interacted in anxious, predatory, violent ways. I happen to think that that is not entirely true. Did that happen? Of course it did. It still happens today. Watch the news. But it wasn't always that way. We share so many characteristics with one another on top of the fact that they remain in our genetic past. So I kept looking, is there something else that can tie us together? Something other than tools, because tools seem to have a natural progression as you make them more reliable and more adapted to an environment. They're going to look more and more alike. So this is what I found. And although what I'm about to show you is disputed by some, and of course it is, because it rocks the timeline boat, people, it is the oldest example of human form. Dating is difficult for these and always contested, but the first two examples are thought to be between 500,000 and 250,000 years old. Scientists believe that these are just examples that nature produced because Homo erectus was too primitive to do this. However, according to the discoverer of the Venus Tantan, the object had been created by natural geological processing, giving it a general human-like shape that was recognized by early man and taken as a portable possession of worth. Then it was accentuated by carving it with stone wedge and a greasy substance on the surface containing iron and manganese, may be the remnants of red ochre, pigments used by humans to further accentuate human-like form. So let's go over them. It's hotly debated and super hard to know for sure when it started, but let's watch what happens with this figure throughout our ancient past. I'll begin with the Venus of Barakhat Ram. Now I'll give you, looking at this one, it's very hard to say that that is human form. But when I look at my kindergartner's artwork, it kind of looks like this, possibly a human form. Now this one is said to possibly be 250,000 years old. Now this is the Venus of Tauntaun. The Venus dates between 500,000 and 300,000 years ago, a much more distinctly human form. You can see where the head, arms, legs, and torso are, for sure. Now watch the progression of the Venus figures through ancient time and tell me if it isn't reminiscent of the progression of language or tools or architecture or anything else we have out there. This is the Venus Hohlefels, dating to around 40,000 years ago and is the oldest undisputed Venus figure. Now we have the Venus of Galgenberg, dated to about 30,000 years ago. This is the Venus of Willendorf, also dated to about 30,000 years ago, also painted with red ochre. Now we have the Venus of Dolny Vestonce. This Venus is dated to about 29,000 years ago. This is one of the Venus figurines of Kostenki, dated to around 25,000 years ago. Now here is the Venus of La Selle. This Venus is also dated to around 25,000 years old and, interestingly, is also painted with red ochre. And these are the Venus figurines of Balzi Rossi, dated to about 20,000 years ago. The first two that I showed you, the Venus of Barakat Ram and the Venus of Tauntaun, were found in archaeological digs that were attributed to archaic Homo erectus. And the rest were found in areas that were thought to have been either Homo sapien or Neanderthals. It is suggested that we learned to speak about 200,000 years ago, and anthropologists say that Homo sapiens, us, didn't really start acting like us till about 100,000 years ago. And only about 50,000 years ago did we start dabbling in art and spirituality. Looking at all the evidence left behind by Homo erectus, I suggest that we work together. We learn from them the beginning of a form of language, the beginnings of tool making, forms of art, and the beginning aspects of spirituality, demonstrated by the Venus. Are they us? No, not really. There's a definite difference. But in the days of old, it probably paid off to learn from those that were ancient, that had seen some things, that might have known what has happened and what is going to happen to a certain extent. Those that had seen some shit. And when we look at the ancient cataclysms that have plagued the earth, maybe there were points where they had no choice but to work together. Anyway, I thought all of it was interesting, all that stuff I was finding about Homo erectus, because that wasn't quite the way I learned about him in school. And I know things have changed, but I thought I would share. Anyway, I hope you guys have yourselves a very great day.